The charity dinner was the biggest event of the year in Denver. 500 people, crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths, the kind of room where everyone was someone, or at least trying very hard to look like it. And right in the middle of all that noise and brightness, a little girl sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, watching the room like she was watching fish in a tank. Beautiful to look at, but impossible to reach. Her name was Maya. She was 8 years old, and she hadn't made a single sound all evening. Not because she was shy, because she couldn't hear any of it. Maya had been deaf since she was 2 years old, after a fever that came fast and left quietly, taking her hearing with it. Beside her sat her father, James Cole, the CEO of Cole Medical Group, one of the fastest growing healthcare companies in Colorado. James was tall, well-dressed, and the kind of man people moved across rooms to speak to. That evening, 3 different people had already stopped by their table to shake his hand and compliment his work. None of them had spoken to Maya, not one. James watched it happen every time. The smile directed at him, the brief, uncomfortable glance toward his daughter, then the quick turn back to safer conversation. He had stopped being surprised by it years ago, but it still hurts. The same quiet, steady hurt of a parent who cannot fix the thing that needs fixing most. He had almost left Maya at home that night. Large events were hard for her. Too many people, too much movement, and no one who knew how to reach her. But Maya had seen the invitation on his desk and pointed at it with hopeful eyes. And James had never been able to say no to those eyes. So here they were. Maya was drawing invisible shapes on the tablecloth with her finger when James's phone buzzed. He leaned toward her and tapped her shoulder gently, their signal. She looked up. He showed her his phone and pointed toward the far side of the room. She nodded. She would be okay. James stood and walked away. Maya went back to her invisible drawing. The old woman came through the side entrance at exactly the wrong moment. Or maybe it was exactly the right one. She was small and slow-moving, wearing a long brown coat that had seen better decades, a plain floral dress underneath, flat shoes with the backs pushed down like she'd been wearing them as slippers. Her gray hair was pinned up loosely at the back, with several strands escaping around her face. She carried a large cloth bag that had been repaired more than once, with safety pins and careful stitching. She did not look like someone who belonged at a 500-person charity dinner. She looked like someone who might ask for a meal at the back door. A waiter near the entrance noticed her immediately. He walked toward her. "Ma'am," he said, keeping his voice low and professional. "Can I help you? This is a private event." The old woman looked at him pleasantly. "I know," she said. "I'm here for dinner." He glanced at his tablet. "Do you have an invitation?" "I do," she said. He looked at her again. The coat, the bag, the shoes, and he scrolled through his list a little too fast to be really looking. "I'm not seeing you on the list," he said. "I'm going to have to ask you to." That's when the event coordinator appeared. A woman in a red dress with a clipboard and the specific energy of someone who had been managing small disasters all evening and was not in the mood for another one. She looked at the old woman. She looked at the coat, the bag, the shoes. Same conclusion, same speed. "I'm sorry," she said, with a particular smile that is not a smile. "This event is by invitation only. I think you may have the wrong venue." "I don't," the old woman said. She was not angry. She was not embarrassed. She said it the way a person states a simple fact. "The sky is blue. The floor is marble. I am in the right place." "Let me get you some information about the shelter on 5th Street, the coordinator said, already turning away. That's when a man in a dark suit stepped forward, one of the event's co-organizers. He had caught just enough of the exchange to feel uncomfortable. "Is everything all right?" he asked. "Fine," the coordinator said. "Just a mix-up." "It's not a mix-up," the old woman said, still pleasantly. She reached into her large cloth bag and produced a small white card. She held it out. The man took it. He looked at it. and something changed in his face. "Patricia," he said quietly, "why don't you go check on the stage setup?" He did not show her the card. He turned to the old woman. "Let me find you a seat," he said, and his voice, unlike everyone else's so far that evening, sounded like he meant it. The old woman's name was Edna Park. She was seated at a small table near the back of the room. Not the best table, but a table with a clear view of everything. She set her cloth bag on the chair beside her, ordered water, and looked around with a relaxed, unhurried expression of someone who had attended many rooms like this one, and stopped being impressed by them a long time ago. That was when she saw Maya. The little girl was still at her table, still drawing invisible shapes, still entirely alone. The seat where her father had been sitting, empty. Around her, conversations hummed and glasses clinked and people laughed at things Maya could not hear from across the room. Maya could not hear any of it either. Edna watched her for a moment. She watched the way Maya's eyes moved, careful, curious, slightly withdrawn. The eyes of a child who has learned that the world is interesting, but not always accessible. Then Edna watched the little girl's hands, just for a second. A brief, unconscious movement when Maya reached for her water glass. But it was enough. Edna had spent 22 years learning to notice exactly that. She picked up her water glass, her cloth bag, and walked across the room. She stopped beside Maya's chair. Maya looked up. She had learned to track movement around her the way all deaf children do, watching the edges of rooms, catching motion before it arrived. She saw the old woman and waited with the cautious expression of a child who had been smiled at by many adults that evening, and understood that a smile did not always mean anything. Edna smiled, and then she raised her hands. Maya went completely still. Her eyes, which had been politely guarded a second before, went wide. Not with fear, with something closer to disbelief. The way you look when someone says a word in a language you thought only you knew. Slowly, carefully, Maya signed back. Edna sat down, and then Maya started talking. She talked about her dog, a beagle named Pepper, who stole socks and was completely unashamed about it. She talked about the book she was reading, a story about a girl who discovers a hidden garden and keeps it secret for an entire summer. She talked about how she wanted to be an architect someday because she liked the idea of designing spaces where people felt at home. Edna listened to every word. She asked questions. She laughed, a real laugh, not a polite one, at the story about Pepper and the socks. And Maya, who had sat quietly in this glittering room for 2 hours with nothing to do and no one to talk to, was suddenly the most animated person at the table. James saw it from across the room. He had finished his call and was making his way back to their table when he stopped. Maya was leaning forward in her chair, hands moving fast, eyes bright, laughing at something the old woman across from her had just signed. James stood completely still. In 8 years, he had spent more money than he could calculate trying to give Maya access to the world. Specialists, schools, technology, programs. He had restructured his entire work schedule around her needs. And in the middle of a charity dinner, he almost hadn't brought her to. An old woman in a worn brown coat had simply sat down and started talking to her. James walked back to the table slowly. He didn't want to interrupt. He sat down quietly and watched his daughter laugh. Actually laugh, with her whole face, at a story she was singing about a beagle stealing socks. He didn't realize his eyes were wet until Maya glanced over and noticed him. She signed something quickly to Edna, who looked at James with a warm, unhurried expression. "Your daughter," Edna said, "has a great deal to say. She just needed someone to ask." James nodded. He didn't trust his voice enough to use it. At the end of the evening, as people were gathering their coats, Maya signed something to Edna that made the old woman go very still. Then Edna's eyes softened, and she reached out and gently held Maya's hand for a moment. James leaned toward his daughter. "What did you say to her?" Maya signed it again, for him. "This is the first time I felt like I was actually at the party and not just watching it." James looked at Edna. "Thank you," he said. I don't know how to. You don't need to, Edna said simply. She picked up her cloth bag, gave Maya one last smile, and walked toward the exit. James watched her go. He turned to his assistant. Who is that woman? He asked. His assistant shook his head slowly. I have no idea. The next morning, James tried to find out. He asked the co-organizer who had seated her. The man mentioned a card, but said he couldn't share the information. It wasn't his to share. He asked the event coordinator. She was still irritated and less helpful than a closed door. He asked 3 other people. Nobody knew who Edna Park was. What he did find out in the days that followed was who had organized and funded the entire dinner. The venue, the catering, the program, all of it, sponsored by something called the Open Hands Foundation, a private nonprofit dedicated to creating resources and community programs for deaf children and their families across Colorado. James had heard of Open Hands. He had been trying to contact them for months. His assistant had sent 4 emails to the foundation's contact address. He had received polite acknowledgments and nothing else. The founder of Open Hands, according to the website, was listed only as E. Park. James stared at his screen for a long moment. Then he picked up the phone and tried again. 3 weeks later, James brought Maya to the Open Hands Community Center for her usual Tuesday visit. It had started 6 months ago, a weekly afternoon where Maya could spend time with other deaf children in a fully accessible environment. Sign language classes, art projects, group activities. For Maya, it was the one place in her week where communication was not an obstacle, where she didn't have to wait while adults figured out how to talk to her, where she was simply one of the kids. She practically ran through the door every Tuesday. James sat in the waiting area as usual. He answered emails. He drank bad coffee from a machine in the corner. He watched through the wide window as his daughter immediately found her group and dove into a conversation about something that had her laughing within 30 seconds. He was halfway through a work email when Maya appeared at the window. She was pointing urgently at something inside the room. Her expression, the specific combination of excitement and disbelief that he had learned to pay attention to. James stood and looked through the window. At the far end of the activity room, seated on a low chair, completely surrounded by children, was a small old woman in a plain house dress. Gray hair pinned loosely at the back of her head. Her hands were moving. The children were responding, singing back fast, all talking at once, climbing over each other to get her attention, laughing at whatever she was saying. She was laughing too. Her whole face was involved in it, completely at ease in the middle of the joyful chaos. James recognized her immediately. He walked to the activity room door and opened it quietly. One of the center's staff members came over. "Who is that?" he asked quietly. The staff member looked surprised by the question. "That's Ms. Edna," she said. "She's here every Tuesday, has been for years. She started coming even before the center had its own building. She used to run the sessions out of her living room." James turned to look at her. "She's a volunteer?" The staff member paused. She seemed to be choosing her words carefully. "She's a little more than a volunteer," she said. Across the room, Maya had made her way through the crowd of children and was now signing rapidly to Edna, clearly telling her about something that had happened since the dinner, something that required both hands and several facial expressions to convey properly. Edna was following every word, asking questions, reacting, fully present. James watched his daughter's face, the same face he had watched go still and careful at the charity dinner. Wide open now, unguarded, completely herself. He walked across the room. Edna looked up when he approached, and something in her expression shifted, a small, warm acknowledgement, like someone who had been expecting this conversation for a little while. "Mr. Cole," she said. "You know who I am," James said. "You're Maya's father," Edna said. "I've seen you through the window on Tuesdays. You always sit in the waiting area and drink bad coffee." "It is very bad coffee," James agreed. He pulled up a small chair and sat across from her. Maya settled beside Edna, leaning slightly against her arm. Content, unbothered, at home. "You're E. Park," James said. It wasn't quite a question. Edna looked at him steadily. "I am. You founded Open Hands." 22 years ago, Edna said. "When my granddaughter was diagnosed at age 3, there was nothing. No community center, no program, no place where she could just be with other children who communicated the way she did. So I built one." James was quiet for a moment. "The charity dinner," he said slowly. "You organized it." "Every year," Edna said. "We use it to raise funds for the following year's programs." "And you came in through the side entrance," James said, his voice quieter now, "in a coat that had seen better days. And they tried to turn you away from your own event." Edna's expression didn't change much. "It happens," she said simply. "People see what they expect to see." "Why didn't you say something?" James asked. "When they were trying to send you away?" "Because I wanted to see what the room would do," Edna said. "I always learn more from watching than from announcing." "And what did you learn?" Edna glanced at Maya. "That your daughter had been sitting alone for 2 hours," she said. "And that was the only thing in the room that actually needed attending to." James sat with that for a long moment. "I've been trying to reach you for months," he said. "My company has an accessibility program. We want to partner with an established deaf community organization to make sure it's done right. My assistant sent 4 emails." "I know," Edna said. "I read every one." "You didn't respond." "I was waiting," Edna said. "For what? To find out if you actually understood the people you were trying to help, or if you were just trying to do something that looked good on paper." James opened his mouth. He closed it again, and he asked. Edna looked at Maya, laughing, signing, completely at home in the room she had helped build. "You bring her here every Tuesday," Edna said. "You sit in the waiting area and drink terrible coffee for 2 hours, because this is the place that makes her feel like herself. You don't come in and observe and take notes. You just wait and let her be." She looked back at James. "That told me more about what kind of partner you'd be than any email could." James was quiet for a long moment. "My assistant tried to schedule a meeting with the founder of Open Hands 4 times, he said finally. "I know," Edna said. "You were here every Tuesday." "I was, drinking the same bad coffee." Edna smiled. "A real one. The kind that started in her eyes and took over her whole deeply lined face." "It really is terrible," she said. "The partnership between Cole Medical Group and the Open Hands Foundation was announced 4 months later. It was the largest private investment in deaf-accessible healthcare infrastructure in Colorado's history. New programs, new facilities, new training for medical staff in basic sign language, so that a deaf patient arriving at any Cole Medical location would be met by someone who could at least say hello. James spoke at the announcement. He told the story of the charity dinner, the old woman in the worn coat, the side entrance, the waiter with his tablet, the coordinator with her polite smile. He told it plainly, without softening it. Then he told the part about Maya, about how his daughter had sat alone for 2 hours in a room full of people who could have spoken to her, and chose not to, and how one woman had walked across the room, sat down, raised her hands, and asked a simple question, "How are you tonight?" and how Maya had not stopped talking since. There was a long silence in the room when he finished. Then Edna, seated in the front row in the same brown coat, the same cloth bag at her feet, stood up, and the room gave her a standing ovation that lasted a very long time. Maya, sitting beside her father on the stage, watched the room full of standing, clapping people, and then turned to sign something to James. He looked at her hands. He smiled. "She says," he told the microphone, "this is the second fancy event where she didn't feel invisible." He looked at Edna. "Thank you for making the first one possible." Years later, when Maya was grown and working as an architect, designing community spaces where people of all abilities felt genuinely welcome, she would tell the story of that night to anyone who asked why she had chosen that particular kind of work. She would tell them about the charity dinner, about sitting alone, about the old woman who came in through the side entrance in a worn brown coat and was almost turned away, about the moment two hands rose in a quiet ballroom and asked a simple question in a language Maya had been waiting her whole life for someone to speak. She would tell them that the woman who did it had spent 22 years building a place where children like Maya could feel at home, and that nobody in the room, not the waiters, not the coordinator, not the wealthy donors, not even her own father, had recognized her, because nobody had looked. The most important things, Maya would say, are almost always carried by people nobody thinks to look at twice. Pay attention to who you walk past. You never know what they're carrying. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, and subscribe. And tell us in the comments, have you ever met someone you almost walked past who turned out to change your life? We read every single one.